Thoughts on water being a life form?
It doesn't produce the processes of life as we know it. But I can say, like in astrobiology, one of the fun things I like to remind people is that we have a good feeling of what life does, but we don't really know what life is. Similarly, for intelligence, we have some kind of idea of what intelligence does to a degree, but we don't really know what intelligence is. And it gets even worse for consciousness. We barely know what consciousness does, and we don't really know what consciousness is. And so there's a lot of possibility out there in the universe for different kinds of things to portray what we see as life, which is really a process happening. And so it makes me think a lot about different kinds of creatures that might be out there in the universe and how they might have information storage over time, how they might transmit information from generation to generation, how they might have functions like metabolism to drive energetic reactions, whether or not they have cellular structures. It's not a guarantee. A lot of people think it might be necessary to have cells, but we don't know for sure. Maybe there's life forms out there that have figured out how to produce life without cells. And so there's a lot of possibility for life in the universe.
This podcast is brought to you by B Micro, a company I'm deeply passionate about because I founded it in 2018. It's USDA organic freeze-dried microgreens for everyday nutrition and detox. Sprinkle them on any meal or take them as a capsule to enjoy the many healthy benefits. Shop now at bmicro.farm. Use code STEVE15 to save. Why do you think so many sci-fi movies show aliens as these gray creatures with huge heads and no genitals? Why do you think that's a popular way of describing aliens?
There are various reasons for that. A really good book that just came out is The Martians, written by David Barron, who lives in Boulder, Colorado. David explores that period of time in the late 1800s and very early 1900s when it was just like common knowledge amongst especially like the elite in Boston and the other places in the country where people just knew that Mars had people. Like Mars had people living there, and a lot of times if they threw a party and they had the Martians visit, it would be somebody basically wearing a suit. It'd be a human in a suit that had some various features that looked a little alien. And so maybe it's not surprising that then as this interest in alien life and kind of like, intelligent alien life was taking off, and after H.G. Wells wrote The War of the Worlds in 1897, it kind of launched this alien invasion sci-fi, and we started having, more storytelling that included this idea of like aliens visiting us or us going out and visiting aliens in early film and things like that. And so maybe it's not surprising that our very first constructs of what an alien should look like would be very human looking. And so that probably fed into a lot of the cultural ideas over time of if you had an experience, what would you consciously imagine or see in the experience as being an alien? So maybe it's not surprising they often have two eyes, maybe bigger eyes, maybe they have long, slender limbs, but usually two arms, two legs, two nostrils. They often mimic humanoid form a lot. So much so that it's kind of questionable because evolution could possibly follow some of those same directions that have led to us and other primates. But there's no guarantee out there in the universe. And if anything, it seems like all the myriad steps it took to get to us, there's just so much other ways evolution could have gone in our own planet's history, let alone a different world with different chemistry and different physical processes. And so I will say, there are convergent processes in evolution. And one of my favorite is trees. We can talk about why trees are so epically awesome. And I think alien trees probably exist. But convergence in evolution, people think a lot about flight. So insects, birds, and bats. They all learned how to fly. They evolved flight separately. So there's no direct lineage of flight that gave us all three of those. Instead, these three different groups formed and then flight happened. And so it makes sense that there should be alien flight as well, that aliens might figure out some form of wing structure or other processes that allow them to get up into their atmospheres. There's convergent processes that do lead to similar form and function. And so maybe there will be like humanoid style-ish creatures out there that have two arms and two legs. It's possible. I don't think it's probable though.
I would love to get into trees. I read a fun fact in preparation for this, and that's that sharks are 100 million years older than trees. So like all life came from the oceans and then kind of crawled out of the ocean and onto land. Is that how you understand it?
We don't really know. And that's one thing I love about science is you just get to say, I don't know sometimes about things, and we don't know where life started on Earth. And anyone who says we do, they're wrong, because even though a lot of people agree that life probably started in the ocean, there have been some good arguments. Recently, Bruce Damer and Dave Deamer, both wonderful scientists and good people, they put out a paper they called the hot spring hypothesis. They've argued that the dilution of the water in the ocean was just so much that the chemistry required to bring life together and encapsulate processes to create enough of the chemistry to allow other things to happen was unlikely in the ocean. They've argued that you needed like wetting and drying cycles on the surface of the land, probably close to the ocean, but maybe more like around like hydrothermal vents geothermal springs on the surface and things like geysers and that kind of stuff. So you think like Yellowstone or Rotorua in New Zealand, like those kind of places are kind of how they're envisioning more of a system for life to start. But that said, life could have started in the oceans, and we do know that the evolution of life does appear to mostly have happened primarily in the oceans for much of life's history. For most of the history of life on Earth, which started, we can say almost for sure 3.5 billion years. Some even have good evidence for 3.8 billion years. Some of us think probably at least around 4 billion years even life could have been here. Through most of the time since then, it was mostly microbes doing microbial things, and there were a lot of changes over time, a lot of evolution occurring, a lot of processes happening. Some of the molecules that we have in our bodies that we find in plants and fungi were developing billions of years ago in these early ancestors of ours so then from them came these other creatures that slowly over time became us. But yeah, sharks have been around for a very long time. Most animals came around during the Cambrian radiation, or some call it the Cambrian explosion. It wasn't really an explosion. It was a process of the evolution kind of spurring greater things happening. But yeah, the vascularization of plants, developing separate tissues where they could transport water and nutrients from one place to another. And the reason I don't say trees is that there was a lot of steps before we get to trees. And vascularization was a really important part. And so we know that at some point, and we have some evidence for when this happened, around the mid-Devonian or so, I think it is, or actually before that, maybe 500 million years ago, mosses came to land. They're these creatures that they reproduce via spores. They don't have like a large root system. Those were the first things kind of coming to land and then spreading all across the land. And then sometime shortly thereafter, tens of millions of years later, plants evolved vascularization, which allowed them to not only build root structures, but to then move nutrients and water to different places. And so it gave them the chance to start adapting to other environments, other ecosystems, to start filling all the ecosystems of the land. And then eventually, life came out of the ocean, or animals came out of the ocean as well, and started, enjoying their life on land with the plants. And then, very early on, plants and animals, fungi, like we were all connected. And so a lot of those early evolutionary changes were happening because plants were being eaten by other creatures, and then those other creatures were also co-evolving with the plants as well. And so now you look across the planet, there's great biodiversity, and a lot of it's driven by these co-evolutionary mechanisms we've had evolving with plants and other organisms through time.
What plant do you think we have the longest relationship with?
Oh my gosh, that's a really fun question.
Like what plant have we been co-evolving with the most, which
Yeah.
for the longest? Who do we've got the deepest?
I mean, if we're talking we like humans, I'm not really sure because we've cultivated so many different plants for food through time. And so our ancestors long ago, hunting and gathering, what kinds of plants were they gathering? Most likely things like berries, easily edible leaves, things like that. Very early on, they probably found psychedelics. And then at some point, we learned how to start growing intentionally, how to have agriculture and grow some plants. And so things like wheat became very important and have co-evolved with us for a very long time. More recently, we've used, these long processes of breeding to create strawberries and cauliflower and broccoli and all these things that we're born from different plants that we kind of slowly selected for different traits. But if we're talking as, like animals in general, I'm not actually sure like how far back we have to go to start seeing where those connections are happening. And again, like we have various molecules in our bodies as animals and our bodies as humans that have been with biology since long before there were plants or animals or fungi.